too. So let's see, things that we reviewed, just kind of points of order before we dive into lecture material. I am going to make sure that all of this is recorded so that anybody else who did not hear this the first time can come back on the video and really hear it. The protocol for these remote Zoom calls, at least to start off, is going to be that questions happen in the chat, that code gets shared on the Slack channel, and that way that most of the immediate conversation can stay right in the Zoom. And then if we need to do multi-line sharing of any sort of code stuff, then we can do that over in the Slack. Also, if you run into any sort of audio or video issues while you're trying to watch a lecture, please let me know. I can check things on my end. If other people are saying that they're hearing things okay, I will proceed with the lecture to make sure that we can just manage the time the best way possible. And then my advice would be to just tag that video for later review. If you have not yet signed into the cohort calendar or followed that link through your Learn assignment or the one that I copied over yesterday in the message, please do check out that cohort calendar, because that is going to be the place that we put all of our lecture code and videos. If you haven't checked it out already, it's also going to be the place that there are Zoom links for further lectures and one-on-ones and stuff that's pre-scheduled. In that spirit of always being a beginner, I just figured out how to pre-schedule Zoom links, and now I feel like my power is limitless on this planet. So in any case, it looks like that Jack is having some issues here, and we're going to make sure that we take maybe another 2 minutes. I'll let Jack know. Still stuck. We can one-on-one about what was covered right after. Sweet. So now I feel like I've said that 3 times. So thanks so much for hearing it 3 times, and hopefully we're going to be in good shape. Okay, cool. And Jack's here. Fantastic. So we made it. Everybody's here, kind of, sort of. Could people real quick let me know that they are hearing me and that they are able to use the chat to ask a question during this lecture by just quick throwing a couple of characters or a word or a cheer or something into the Zoom chat at this point. Cool. Joseph, glad you can hear. Rah, rah, like a dungeon dragon. Sweet. Ooh, fancy with the emoji. He's got a second Zoom window open on a phone through a VPN, and so he's got the access to the emoji keyboard real quick. Solid. Nice to see that folks are here and able to hear. That's good. Cool. I'm going to share a screen here in a second. I'm kind of looking around at how cluttered my desktop is and feeling very embarrassed. You're like company that's about to come over, and I'm just frantically throwing dishes into the oven right now. That's kind of just what you got to do sometimes. Let's be real about it. Okay. All right. Cool. So let's do a quick screen share now that I can see that like people are able to hear and see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. See, Jack, are you able to hear? If you could type into the chat if you're able to. Sweet. Let's see, who else? Mike, Jason, Ellis, Ethan. Adam, are you able to hear everything that's going on? Ask a question in the chat if you need to. Cool. Solid. Thanks. Yeah, and let's just feed any questions typed into this little chat here. I'm going to share my screen and show you what I'm seeing on my end, by the way, which, of course, the second I share it, you can't see the chat the same way that I can. That's clever of me. So let's see. If we go into our view here, where did my chat go? Oh, dear. Do I lose my chat when I'm screen sharing? Let's see. Oh, there it is. Chat. Cool. So I've got this group chat here. It is open. I think I can like make this like a nice little skinny window. I'm not even sure like what the best workflow for myself is going to be as I use this. So please bear with me as I like try to kind of scoop around and find that as we go. For now, I am going to minimize my video feed, keep the chat as like the main thing that I can see, and I want to dive in and I want to talk about Rails. Can people? I'm not sure if people are going to hear the audio on the music that plays right now, but I'm gonna play this. So it's like some classical music popping off right now. That classical song, right? And this is the process of building a Sinatra application. And we can see that they're really going in, right, down to the wire, like from the basics. Config environment, they're writing that file out themselves. They're manually creating some new stuff. Cool. So yeah, lost the audio. Great. Can you hear me when the video is not playing? Is that cool? Was the video just from the YouTube just now when the video was playing? Somebody chat me back. Let me know. Can you hear me now? Oh no! Well, let's see. Let me close back out. Let me hop back into this. Can you hear me now? People hear me now? Let's see. Audio just stopped. Hang on a sec. Let me try this. Pull the mic. Check 1 2. Check 1 2. Am I audible there? Back? Okay. Cool. So we just learned something about when I start playing a YouTube video with audio, right? That I think that what just happened was probably that YouTube took over the audio feed and then it failed to give it back to my headset maybe after I stopped the video. So what I'm actually going to do is just kind of like fly through this and like stop at some various screenshots. Am I still audible now as I fly through and stop at various screenshots? There I am, audio gone, there I am, in and out. Okay, so I think that YouTube is maybe going to be a problem. Let me try this one more time. Okay, now I'm talking again. Am I a little easier to hear, harder to hear? Keep me in the loop. Okay, so I'm not going to attempt to play this YouTube video anymore because I think that that's the cause of running into audio degradation and stuff like that. I'm going to go back to the view that I had before, where my chat window stays up, and find that. I was on my screen share. Cool. Get my chat window back open so I can hear what's happening here. So I'm not as loud as before. Let's try this. Check 1 2. Check 1. Test 1 2. Am I audible? That was my cat in the background. My dog is terrorizing my cat. Pretty good. Yeah, if anybody else has audio playing, make sure that you don't. If you mute yourself, that's a good Slack etiquette thing. That'll probably make it a little bit easier. Yeah. Sorry, I should have mentioned that at the beginning. When we're on a Zoom call together, we always want to be muted if we're not the one like speaking at that moment. Cool. Sweet. Thanks so much for the feedback. I am going to assume that we have a quorum of people that can hear at the moment. And what we just saw as I was attempting to play that YouTube video was somebody kind of putting together a Sinatra app step by step, right? And as we've learned this week, there's a lot of little things that you can configure, right? We can configure where the views folder is supposed to be. We can configure... Oh, what else? Let's go in here and check. Here's that CRUD lab from before, right? In Sinatra, we like have this config.ru. We specifically say like, here are the controllers by name that we want to use. Oh, we do want to do the HTML hack. That's like an optional thing for us that we get to play with and decide on, right? In our config environment, we have a situation here where like we're connecting to a database. We are explicitly saying like, yeah, let's use these gems. Let's set the environment here. And a lot of kind of manual typing in of things, right? Somebody had to build this, right? This wasn't just like given to us by forerunners. An actual human being looked at how a Rails app kind of comes together and said, I want to mimic that in Sinatra. So they created a file structure and a requirement path that kind of mimics what Rails does in Sinatra. But they had to do it all by hand, right? Over here, let's look at a controller route, right? Get articles ID. We have to be very explicit about like what kind of HTTP method there's going to be and what kind of action is happening, right? So if we have an articles controller show action, we're going to have get articles ID. If we had a categories controller and wanted to do a show action there, we'd probably have something like categories controller and then get categories ID, right? And so that pattern wouldn't really change. And after a while, we might get tired of this pattern where we have this manual configurability, but we keep on typing things in by hand. And as we keep on typing things in by hand, we notice that we're typing the same things over and over. And as programmers, we're sort of lazy in a benevolent way that we just don't want to waste time doing stuff that we already know how to do perfectly and could automate. So we try to find ways to like, maybe instead of saying like, get articles ID, we just come up with a keyword show. And if I apply the word show to a given object class, like if I have cat, and I say I want to have a show route for a cat, then the computer can say, okay, let me downcase the cat class name, and then we'll pluralize it. So that's going to be cats. and then we'll do a slash, and then we'll do a parameter ID, and that'll be a get route, because that's what a show is for any object, and that's the pattern we could use. So eventually, as developers, we don't want to do all this typing by hand, right? This is very configurable. It's very nice to be able to like trace through our path and see like, oh, this inherits from application controller. Application controller, oh, we can see where we've like set these folders up, right? We have configured this application by having a lot of like touch control over how things are set up. What I want to talk about today is getting away from configuration. I want to talk about getting to convention instead. I'm going to run through this README and just kind of like scan through it. I think it's a good like personal read as you're going through your own labs. So I'm just going to fly through some of this stuff so we can just get into the Rails and have fun with it. But it was made by a guy named DHH, or David Heinemeier Hansen. He works at a company called 37 Signals, and then they turned into Basecamp after one of their products like really took off and became the reason for their company. And the code that they were managing their own product with was called Ruby on Rails internally to the company. And then they basically decided like, yeah, I want Ruby on Rails to like be an open source thing that other people can use, because it helped us to build a site really well, and maybe it can help other people to build their sites really well too. The three principles that Rails follows is we're going to use Ruby, and we're going to use MVC, and we're going to still be Rubyists, right? We're still going to try to optimize for being happy, right? And what DHH believes is that happiness comes from not having to make a lot of choices, right? Which is funny because that's the opposite of what Mats said, right? That like joy for him in Ruby was like, give programmers choices of what they want to do. But in Rails, part of happiness is that when we have all of the complexity of Sinatra, right? When we have the opportunity to break our code because HTML was wrong, or because a controller had a syntax error, or because a model associated badly, or because a migration field was mistyped, or mistyped, right? A string instead of a text or something like that. So many different places that code could cause problems. We didn't find the right view file. We didn't find the right view folder. We embedded, but we didn't render. That what if we just took out some of the guesswork about programming and stopped saying like humans should be able to always type everything into their application exactly how they want, instead to say, most of the time when humans type, it ends up looking exactly the same. Articles show and categories show are the same. Why do we make people type that out all the time? So happiness can come through convention when we only need to code out the stuff that's not boilerplate, that's not totally standard. And that's really what kind of like Rails is all about here. I'm not even sure that this image still like is visitable, but I'm going to try it out. Might be busted. Yeah, this is it. Cool. So the core premise of Rails is controversial because we need to eliminate valueless choices. The controversy here is that some choices are valueless, right? I think we do live in a society that kind of maybe almost fetishizes choice, like that just being able to say like I moved and I did a thing and it happened because of me is necessarily a good thing. But sometimes I wanted to not have the opportunity cost of making that choice. I'd rather be able to make a different choice, right? So having great defaults lets me not spend a lot of time doing the work that's covered by the defaults, and then I can really finish my work, create a complete application, right? Not just an application where everything's hooked up, but where things look nice, where the user interface is really solid, where people like enjoy using your app because it solves their human problem. So we're going to let the machines follow conventions to solve all of the problems that are automatable, and then that leaves us open to move to a higher level of thinking where we can do a little bit more with our code. That's kind of how Rails is built. And accordingly, those conventions are sometimes going to piss some people off, and they might piss you off. Like, why did they make it like this? And the answer is because it worked for us, and if you don't like it, you can try something else. Invariably, that's what DHH would tell you. And because Rails is omakase, let me look this up real quick. There's a quick link here. Rails omakase. The kind of attitude of this guy, right? But he compares himself to a sushi chef at a sushi restaurant. And he basically says, like, you might not personally like eel, but if you don't like eel, that's kind of a you problem, because you've come to me as the sushi chef and I'm telling you that this eel is good in this dish. And if you don't like my opinion on this, you don't have to eat at my restaurant, but this is my thing and I'm going to make it like this. So yeah, that's kind of his view on Rails, that he believes that the people who have built Rails are like a team of sushi chefs who have chosen the right ingredients, the right APIs. They've figured out exactly what kind of like workflows, and sometimes they make decisions that are personal and quirky and you don't personally agree with them. I think the goal of today, going through next week, is to accept that we're walking onto a playing field that we don't quite understand. and something that looks unfamiliar to us, we literally might not understand the context for why that's not a weird or silly thing to do. And I would just ask that people kind of trust the conventions and the process that's in front of them, and trust that deeper understanding of how things are working will come as we start to cross-apply things that we've learned through Sinatra this week to the new Rails stuff. So in any case, our goals today, we're going to make a new Rails app. We're going to compare between Sinatra routes and Rails routes. We're going to make a controller. We're going to make some actions and methods. We're going to make views. We're going to make a model. We're going to make routes. We're basically going to make a little bit of an application in Rails here. And along the way, we're going to talk about like some cool stuff that can happen. So I'm in this Rails app right now, actually. This README is inside of an application called Rails Intro. And you might not know it because the structure is very similar to Sinatra. But then when I open this up, it becomes apparent, right? No longer do we just have models, views, controllers. We've also got stuff called assets, channels, helpers, JavaScript, jobs, and mailers. We have this bin folder, which includes a whole bunch of stuff for if this app was going to be built remotely to serve on somebody else's computer, right? We still have config. There's just a lot more stuff in config now. Like, holy cow. Now database.yaml does come in by default, and this does manage like my database connection. So the little weird thing that I've had to do on Sinatra apps is now not a weird thing. So I'm sticking my tongue out like, I'm not weird anymore. I'm just regular like everybody else in Rails. In any case, config has tons and tons of stuff in it that we can tweak. Environments, there's that production environment I was talking about. In Rails, they figure that you're going to ship some code when you write it. So they always give you production environment by default to start. That's an example of convention over configuration. They won't wait for you to make some of these files. They just give them to you, even if you never use them or edit them. So I'd still say that the app folder is where we handle our MVC concerns in general. Models, views, controllers are still there. You can worry about the other stuff as it's revealed or becomes necessary. Config is still where a lot of like setup and settings kind of stuff happens. And then we have the DB folder, which still holds our migrations. It still holds our schema, and it still holds our seeds.rb file. Right now, we don't have a migrate folder because we haven't created or run any migrations. We haven't generated anything in this application. We've also got a rake file. There's Rails tasks now. So now we'll start saying like Rails instead of rake for some of our rake tasks, if we want to. I believe we can use both syntaxes, and we'll play with that too. But as we walk through like the files here, some stuff looks the same, right? We still have a gem file that still tells us where our gems are. The level of organization and commenting is much higher because Rails assumes that you as a programmer want to learn more about stuff. So they totally like, if there's a gem, they might tell you in a comment like where you can go to get to the docs on the gem. And I think that you should appreciate this documentation style that includes links. In my editor, I can hold Option over a link, and then when I click, it will open in my browser, which is kind of a cool thing, and then I can learn more about what's going on under the hood. There's definitely rabbit holes to fall into. In general, this is like any other gem file that we've seen, except now we have these group blocks, which let Rails only install gems to be used in certain environments. So for example, we don't have pry anymore, we have bybug for debugging. So we just literally type the word bybug somewhere. Let's see how a rake task works in this app, just to test this one little piece out real quick. I'm going to go into db seeds.rb, and I'm just going to write bybug. And then if I go to my terminal, and I'm going to bring this up so that I don't have the full screen covered by everything. I'm just going to say Rails-T, kind of like I used to call like rake-T. And this gives me a whole bunch of tasks, right? And in this task is included db seed, right? So we got that. I'm going to say Rails db seed just to run that seeds file. See how bybug works. Cool. And now we're here. This looks just kind of like pry, right? Like it's not as color coded. If I say here like array equals 4, 3, 2, right? And then I say array dot first. Oops, dessert. It's like something that Missy Elliott would say. Cool. So this is like just Ruby, right? It's a pry session essentially. You could think of it as any debugger. It's interactive Ruby. IRB is kind of running under the hood in any of these cases. Interactive Ruby is what IRB stands for. So I say that, right, to show bybug and to show off how seeds works and to show how like I can say, I could have also said rake db seed, by the way. It would have taken me to the same place. And I'm showing this because like you're going to see that a lot of things in Rails are not that different from Sinatra. Instead of saying pry, I say bybug, right? But like it still works the same way. I can still do the same stuff. I have a lot more stuff in the app folder, but like models is still there. I can still work with models. I can still work with controllers. I can still write views, and I can put them inside of different stuff. You'll see that like the views end with .html.erb. This is like basically saying if you can't evaluate this as ERB, then just render it as HTML. That's why it's dangerous to click on a link that's called like not a virus at all .mp3.exe .txt.bmp.mp4. You shouldn't do that because you don't want your computer to evaluate that as an executable. That could be a problem. Anyways, we have bybug here. We have seeds, the kind of same way that we've seen. But going back to this gem file real quick, like why is bybug sitting in group development test? Well, because we also have a group called production, right? And since Rails gives us a group production, they know that like any app that's used that uses Rails to be built will potentially have some of that default conventional Rails code in there. And Rails programmers don't believe that any sort of debugger should ever live in production code, because production code is code that general users see. And if a general user is able to look at a debugger, that means that they might be able to access information about your database schema, information about like user IDs that are stored in the database, other stuff that's stored in the database that they shouldn't have access to. Like IP addresses for internal stuff that should probably be obscured for security reasons. You basically would never want to put a debugger in production. So by using this group, we make sure that bybug only ever works in the development or test environment. So we can have one Rails app that's really configured for specific stuff. We only need Capybara for testing, right? We only need Selenium, which is basically like the ghost browser that Capybara looks at. We only need that when we're using Capybara. Yeah, so we have different gems than the ones that we've seen before. We'll talk about bcrypt next week when we talk about users and passwords, which is super fun. But here, like Rails itself is a gem, which is kind of weird because when you install the gem Rails, Rails is also responsible for creating an application which installs another copy of the Rails gem that's local to that application. So it's almost like a Russian nesting doll that knows how to build more copies of itself inside of itself as it needs to. Kind of fun. Let's talk about how this app got here, though. Let's talk about generating an application. So going back to these steps, how did Rails intro come to be? Well, let's talk about it. New tab. I'm going to get away from any tab that's open and doing stuff that's not Rails related right now. I'm going to go back out of Rails intro. cd ... and I'm going to do Rails new. First, you could say gem install Rails. If you're playing along at home, and I might not recommend that because over the remote format, it might be easy to get like too distracted and have to switch back to a screen and then miss something and then you mistype it and then you get disconnected from what we're doing. In any case, that's what like gem install Rails does, right? It's just a gem. Rails gives you a command. If you want, you can always say like -h for most of these gems, and it gives you like some help stuff. So this is like some documentation for how to use Rails. Listed in here, where is it at? Rails, options, description. The Rails new command creates a new Rails application with a default directory structure and configuration at the path you specify. How kind of you, Rails. The reason this lecture is called Boom Rails is I can do this. Rails new, what if we said Opera House? So what's it doing? It's making some files. It's doing some bundling. It's installing some gems and some dependencies. It's running some startup steps on those things to generate folders and files. We're adding different things into our code base. We're linking all of these gems so they know how to talk to each other. Rails basically knows how to build itself from zero. I think of this as like the scene in Iron Man 2 where all he has to do is like open that briefcase on the racetrack and he ends up wearing the entire super suit within 30 seconds. Rails is built by people who want to make you happy, and so they know that configuring a new application is one of the more painful things that you can do. They attempt to give you everything that you need to start with. If I look at this now, I can see that Opera House is a folder that I've installed, right? I've created a new app. It's generated a folder Opera House, and I can go in there, and then I'm inside of a Rails app, right? We've got a gem file lock, readme, rake file, app folder, db folder, config folder, all this other stuff. We got our test in here. We got some storage stuff going on, public. If I go to enter into the code here, we're inside of another Rails app, right? The Rails README by default is a little different than the one that we're looking at now. That's another change that I made before this lecture. But aside from that, like, we're looking at the same kind of code here. It's not just that you can generate an app, though. Like, in Rails, you kind of use the word generate itself, like literally the word generate, to do some other stuff. So I want to talk about generation. We used Rails new to generate the entire app. Now that I'm back in Rails intro, I want to talk about like generating other stuff in Rails. One thing that you're allowed to generate in Rails, just like we've done in Sinatra, is a migration. So in a migration, we would have said what? Rake, db, create, migration, right? In Rails, it's a little different. We'll say Rails generate migration. And in Sinatra, we would have said like name equals and then like put in the name. Rails is a little kinder. It just expects the next argument to be the name. So I'm going to say, let's make a migration called create. What are we going to make today, y'all? We're going to make yo-yos. Create yo-yos. And I want both Y's to be capitalized. So I'm going to put an underscore there, because I always have to remember how active record translates, and if I want yo-yos to be two different words in the class name, I need to denote that with an underscore when I'm doing the snake case Ruby variable style. So I say Rails generate migration, create yo-yos. It beeps and boops for a second. It runs some stuff. It creates the createyoyos.rb. And it created that in db migrate. So now if we go and look, we saw that our files just jumped when we hopped back in here, and that's because this migrate folder was added, pushed some things down. And hey, look at this. This is exactly what we've seen before, right? This isn't anything new. This is a migration, which is like good news, bad news, right? Like if you have been struggling with migrations, like the bad news is that you will continue to have to struggle with them and get better at them until this becomes comfortable. And the good news is that once they became comfortable to you in Sinatra, they're going to be comfortable to you in Rails. And the even better news is if they're not comfortable to you yet with your Sinatra experience, you have more time to get comfortable with them here. And you don't have to start from scratch on this particular part of the app build. We're going to create table yo-yos. This is going to have t.integer diameter. I think it's going to have a color. I think it's going to have a type. Like, is it going to be like the... Oh, but I can't say type. We talked about that. So what if I say like... we'll just say the name of the yo-yo. Cool. Not a type. String. Sorry. Talked as I typed, and I always get confused when I do that. Create yo-yos, so I want an integer and 2 strings for diameter, color, and name. Let's get timestamps on here too. That's just a good best practice. So if I've generated this migration, and I want to run a migration, that's actually the exact same thing that we've done before. I can say rake db migrate. Let's try Rails db migrate since we're doing Rails things now. But the syntax here is the same. Why? Because Active Record handles this connection to the database, and the rake tasks that we created for Sinatra were built off of the Rails rake tasks, right? It's not that like Rails is based on Sinatra. It's that you've been deliberately taught a way to do Sinatra to prepare you for Rails, right? Because that's the power of a convention. When you learn it in one place, it's transferable to somewhere else. We've migrated our yo-yos migration. Now if I said Rails C, that is a shorthand for Rails console, and that gets me into the console, right? So can I get a yo-yo? Yo-yo dot all. Uninitialized constant yo-yo. Oh, sure, that makes sense, right? Because we didn't make a model. We only made the migration. So same kind of stuff. We just need to, let's do the generate thing. Rails generate. You know what? Generate's a long thing to type. I'm just going to say G. Rails G model yo-yo. Check this out. Conflict. Another migration is already named create yo-yos. But wait a second, I didn't say create a migration, I said create a model. Check it out, y'all. Rails, when you say G model, assumes that there's going to be a migration under the hood, right? And so you can generate a model and a migration at the same time, which is kind of wild. Check this out. You can also do generation in reverse. So let me like rewind time and start with the model generation instead of a migration generation. Currently, the migration that we had was this create yo-yos, right? So I'm going to reverse time. I'm going to do a Rails DB rollback. Always necessary before you do anything with an existing migration that's run. That rolls back our create yo-yos, so now we don't have a table. And now we have this migration. I could say Rails D, which is delete, right? D migration, create yo-yos. And now it's removed that file, right? So Rails gives me a really nice syntax from the command line to generate and then to delete whole chunks of code, which lets me like test out features quickly or like bring things in to play with and then remove them or rework them as I see fit. So now that I've done the migration reversal, right, I have nothing in here. If I go back to my DB, there's nothing in migrate anymore, and I have no model in my app models. So now if I do the G model, Rails G model yo-yo. Not only can I do this, by the way, but I can tell it what attributes a yo-yo has. This is really cool. Check this out. We have name, color, and then we also have diameter, but diameter is not a string, which is the default for Rails. So I'm just going to say integer here for diameter. Let's see what happens. Okay, so we've created a migration, we've created a model, we've also created a test file in something called test unit, which is similar to RSpec with slightly different syntaxes, but it's a testing framework. It's generated test code, models, and migration for me. If we go to yo-yo.rb, well, actually, hang on, that's the deleted migration. Let's get rid of that. That's confusing. It said deleted up in the tab there, so I just didn't want it to be kind of lingering. So it did already create a class yo-yo, inheriting from application record. That's interesting. Application record. Let's see what that's doing. Oh, sure. It's just inheriting from active record base and saying anything in this application is an abstract class. Basically, application record is similar to how application controller has been working for us, right? Where we have like an application level class that actually does the inheriting from the base object, and then any of our class members can just inherit from the application class. That lets us configure things at an application level instead of having to repeat ourselves at the class level when it's time to configure. In any case, we made this model. That file was pretty simple, right? It's kind of what we've seen before, the only change being that we inherit through this one level of abstraction, trusting application record to do its job. That's one difference between Sinatra and Rails in the models. Let's go to this migration and see what generated, though. Yo, it's like I didn't delete that file just now, right? Like I was able to say name, color, and then diameter, integer, and it dropped that stuff in there, and it dropped the timestamps in there too. So I didn't need to write that migration by hand. It was enough for me to literally just write Rails G model yo-yo, name, color, diameter, integer, right? What if like each yo-yo trick, like what if these are sentient yo-yos? They have names and they invent tricks, right? I'm creating like a new Bandai Namco property at this moment, and I'm deciding that like the tricks are like, yeah, did Rails add timestamps by default? Yeah, Rails totally added these timestamps by default, and they added the white space between, right? Let me do this again. I'm gonna make another one of these models so we can like literally see the new migration from scratch without like nothing up my sleeves, right? So I'm gonna say that a yo-yo has many tricks, and each trick belongs to exactly one yo-yo, right? So it's like my walk the dog is not the same as your walk the dog, for the same reason that like Miles Davis's Freddie Freeloader is not the same as like Terrence Blanchard's, right? Just different instruments, different musicians, different styles. So here we're gonna say Rails G model trick, and a trick is going to have a title, and it's going to have a duration that's an integer, and it's going to have a yo-yo ID, because a trick belongs to a yo-yo. Cool. And since G model also covers the migration concern, I'm expecting to go into this migrate folder. Check it out. It did add the timestamps on there, and then it also has, now a trick has a title, a duration, and a yo-yo ID, right? One thing that Rails will not generate is like associations. So if I wanted to make sure that each trick knew about the yo-yo that it belongs to by a foreign key called yo-yo ID, then I could go into the models and say it belongs to yo-yo. Then down here I could say has many tricks. right? And now I've got some models set up, right? We've got some migrations ready to go. This is usually the part of like a Sinatra build where if I can get this far, I want to get into the console and like make sure that things still connect together. I think that's still the case when I'm building stuff in Rails, like certain things transfer over. Let's do a Rails DB migrate. Cool, created yo-yos, created tricks, and then we'll do a Rails C to get into the console. I'm going to say yo-yo.create. By the way, any class name where you have to capitalize every other letter, don't do that to yourself. I'm realizing this now. Don't live like I've lived. Live better. We'll say name, and we'll call this butterfly Uno. And the color is going to be blue. And I want an orange. I want a monarch butterfly. I went to the butterfly thing at Frederick Meyer Gardens a lot in West Michigan. They had these butterflies. They opened their wings, and it was like this bright, bright blue color, but they'd never land on you, but the monarchs always would. Diameter, we'll say 4. Sure, why not? Let's create this yo-yo. Boom, cool. So it still shows us, like any other console we've been in, like what SQL is running, which is a nice like check to make sure that we're really connected with our database. Yo-yos does have name, color, diameter. We're attaching the right attributes to the right places. We get stuff in there. It comes back and returns a yo-yo with ID 1. Great, now I know that there's a yo-yo in the database that exists. I'm going to quickly make a second one just so I can like compare. We'll do a... sure. Cool, so there's 2 yo-yos in here. Let's make a trick. How do they look? I always say like objects.all and then just object by name. The class rather. I say class.all and then the class name, and that gives me like the schema printout right here in the console. And then I'll say trick.create. Let's see, title will be tightrope. Duration will be 5 seconds, and it belongs to the butterfly yo-yo because they do the tightrope tricks the best. Cool. So now I should be able to say like trick.first, and there's the first trick, and I should be able to say trick.first.yo-yo. Yeah, and so the belongs to works. And if I say yo-yo.first, does it have a trick in its tricks collection? And it does. Trick 1 is in there. So now I know that like yo-yos and tricks are like connected together. And once again, this is all like pretty boilerplate stuff. The next thing that gets kind of weird is how we actually get this stuff on the web. So now that I know that I have some data, I kind of want to figure out how do I get this up on a Rails application. That means that there needs to be a view that gets rendered, similar to what we've done in Sinatra. And the view needs to get rendered from a controller. So if we come back to the README here, like the next thing that we need to do now that we've done some generating is to figure out like what is the difference in similarity between Sinatra and Rails, and like let's get some controllers and some actions into a controller. This starts a little slow and then it starts going pretty quick because unlike in Sinatra where we would have a get and then a literal string for a URL, we handle controller stuff in config in Rails. So we go here, let's exit back out, and I want to show you something. This is kind of cool. I always remember Rick Ross when I think of this because Rick Ross rakes routes. If I say rake routes, it's a rake task that tells me what routes my application has, which right now I don't have any routes defined. I have Rails routes, which we are probably going to use a lot more often now because it's 2020 and not 2017. It's Rails routes, and it says we don't have any routes defined. Please add some routes in config routes.rb. So this is weird. Instead of having a controller where we're going to define the method in URL and then the work to be done right in one place, now in Rails we're going to be mapping method URL pairs with controller classes and methods within those classes. So we're going to have this pattern where a controller will have it'll be a class like this, and we'll have a method in it called like def index as an instance method. And so if this was the cat's controller, I'd have to say, like, let's go to the cat's controller at the index route and let's associate that with get cats. And we have to do that in this routes.rb file. So let me kind of show you how that looks. We're going to play around with it a little bit more as the day goes on, and I'm sure it's where a lot of questions are going to come up. So if I go to config routes.rb, we have this block, rails.application.routes.draw. Within this block, I am able to create routes. I can say get slash yo-yos, yo-yos to yo-yos index then I could say like this is as the index, or I could actually say as yo-yos. So this is me basically saying, like, if I wanted to create a path about seeing all the yo-yos, I could name that path yo-yos, and I could say that in a yo-yos controller there would be an index, and then we'd also make a route get yo-yos. Now if I go back to my terminal and say Rails routes, what comes out? Oh no, I have an argument error. I haven't drawn my route correctly. So what am I going to do? Let me go to the documentation, because I'm actually pretty close here, but I'm not right on it. And so I'm going to go to the Ruby on Rails docs, which they just call guides. This is the best documentation that you've seen so far in your career as a coder, and I strongly recommend that you spend a good amount of time in here. If we look at how to do some routing in Rails real quick, I'm going to move this group chat down so I can like do some search stuff just for a second. Let's see, routing, active model, views, controllers. Okay, Rails routing from the outside in. This section here covers what we're talking about now. Very close. I shouldn't have capitalized things. This is the pattern. We have the verb, the URL, comma, and then we pass in a key value pair where 2 is the key, and then the value is what's the controller that we're dealing with and what's the action inside of that controller. So I'm going to say yo-yos under lowercase and underscored. Get yo-yos to yo-yos index. Let me try this and see if this works a little bit better. Yeah, so now, because I said as yo-yos, it gives me this prefix. Rails basically knows how to like let you call a method based on these route prefixes, and based on that method call, it gives you the matching URL. So if I said yo-yos path now in my Rails application, it would give me the URL / yo-yos. Right? And if I said like yo-yos URL, it's going to do the same thing. Basically, like prefixing gives me the ability to call methods and generate URLs through those methods. The important thing here is that the yo-yos controller index action is going to pick up a request to get yo-yos. So how would I actually test this out? I could set up a shotgun, right, in Sinatra. In Rails, we do it differently. We have a server, so I'd say Rails server. Most commonly, people just say Rails S. The port is different on a Rails server. It's going to not run on 9393. It's going to run on localhost 3000. So I'm going to open up 3000 right now. Yeah, you're on Rails. This is the default welcome page. What's happening now is that it's actually rendering, if we go here to the application controller, there's nothing there, nothing in routes. So we just have like some default code that's being rendered. We can go to our views to find it. Views, application. Oh, you know what? I think it might actually be in assets. Nope. Any case, this is like a basic welcome page in Rails. I do want to stress that like in this views layouts thing, everything in Rails that's happening is going to happen inside of this body tag. Like every ERB that renders is rendering right here where this yield happens. And technically every time that we say ERB from a controller, even in Sinatra, we've really been saying render the application's layout file, and then when it gets to yields, render the file specifically that you're thinking of. There's labs that talk about this in more detail this week. I just wanted to glance at that for a second. But let me go to this yo-yos path and let's see what the version of like Sinatra doesn't know this ditty is in Rails. Check this out. This is kind of fun. Yo-yos. No route matches. Get yo-yos. Well, how come? Let me look at my Rails routes. We just had get slash y. Oh, look at that. It's yo-yos. The URI pattern is different from the controller action. So when you have to have different words, they want you to put dashes in between the words in the URL. So let's try that. Yo dash yos. What you're going to see me do a lot, kind of instinctively, is come back to a Rails routes call. So like even if I'm running a Rails server here, I might use my other tab now instead of just doing console stuff to just have my Rails routes up in front of me. Today, this morning, I think is going to be about learning how this Rails routing works and how it applies to the work that you're going to be doing over the weekend. Yo-yos, okay, so get yo-yos. The error is different here. Uninitialized constant yo-yos controller. In Rails, we can generate those too if we want. So I can say Rails G controller yo underscore yos. That's created an app views yo-yos folder for me to put all of the yo-yos views in for the separate folder stuff. We've created a yo-yos controller, and then we've also created some tests and some CSS stuff for those views. I'm just going to worry about the controller and the views for now. So if I go up to controllers, we do have a yo-yos controller. It's automatically inheriting from application controller, so that should make this error go away. Now I refresh, we have a yo-yos controller, but the action index could not be found, right? As I defined this route from the beginning, I wanted something called index to handle the path yo-yos because I'm trying to follow this RESTful routing convention, right? By the way, like this is a debug window here. If you have an error, oh yeah, that's what my params look like, right? I could say like yo-yo dot new. Right, I can do any sort of stuff in here to debug, which is kind of slick. But yeah, we need to define an index action here in this yo-yos controller. And we do that, like I said, with a method definition. So I say def index instead of making a block now. And in def index, I could say like yo-yos equals yo-yo.all to kind of review some stuff that we've done in Sinatra style, right? And we'll still do like an ERB here. But we don't have to say the word ERB. We could use the word render instead. Render, we can pass a symbol of index. And we can have a views folder here. Where's our views? Views, yo-yos. And then within yo-yos, I'm going to make an index.erb. I'm going to follow the style of the other ERBs in this, though. And I'm going to say .html.erb now. And I'm going to say yay, just to celebrate if we get here. Let's refresh. Yay! We did get there. That's kind of cool. I'm going to comment out this render index. Maybe that's just refreshing from the cache. Interesting, it's not. It's not refreshing from the cache. This is like really happening, y'all. It's just guessing that because I'm in a method called index and I created a file in the views for the same kind of thing. So I'm in the yo-yos controller, right? So if I'm in the yo-yos controller index action, then it's going to assume that I want to render something in a yo-yos folder called index. That's Rails convention over configuration, right? I don't need to specify that I'm rendering a file that matches the name of my route anymore. Because, like, why? Like, why would I say def index, render index, def show, render show, def new, render new? It's going to try to do that for me if the file exists. If the file didn't exist, I'd get some kind of an error. But right now, we can go at yo-yos, index, h1, we'll say hello, yo-yos. We can iterate through our yo-yos here. Yo-yo.all, yo-yos.all, sorry, .each. Do yo-yo, close our tags, get an iteration popping with a little embedding, and then we'll print out, I don't know, let's do a paragraph with just the yo-yo.name. Something like that. See what we got. Hello, yo-yos. Yo-yos.each. Oh, I didn't render the name. There we go. Butterfly, Uno, and Raider. So now we're starting to get some stuff on a Rails page, right? This is one way that we can build controller routes, right? That we can specify one route like this, and we can write it out by hand. We don't need to do that, though. Check this out. If I say resources yo-yos and then I run Rails routes, it gives me the RESTful 7 plus the copy on patch put, right? And it sets prefixes for them. So I can say yo-yo's path and it gives me /yo-yos. I can say new yo-yo path and it's going to give me yo-yo's new. I can say edit yo-yo path and it's going to give me yo-yo's ID edit. And it's my job when I call edit yo-yo path, I have to pass in a yo-yo because it needs to know what the ID is going to be when it draws that URL. Same thing here. If I say yo-yo path singular, I better pass it the yo-yo that path is about because all the yo-yo paths are yo-yo's ID, right? With just different HTTP verbs with them. And based on how the verb combines with a given path, we have a given controller and action set up. And this will specify everything that my app is able to do. I do have a yo-yo's controller now. So if I said resources yo-yos, I've technically drawn a path for yo-yo's new, right? I should be able to go to /new now, and I think I'm going to see an error that I just don't have an action. Oh no, no route matches, get yo-yo's new. Let's check it out and see why. Oh, very strange. You know what I did? When I drew my route, I drew it with a hyphen, didn't I? That's why I was having trouble getting between like the hyphen and the underscore. I did really want it to be underscored, and resources yo-yos made everything underscored by default for me. Now I see what I'm missing. yo_yos.new/new. Action new couldn't be found. We could build a new action, right? In the controller. We could say def new. And then here we could like attempt to build a form, right? Right now, if I go here, it's going to tell me it's missing a template for request formats. It's missing a text HTML. And then it even tells me the thing that I was just talking about. It expects an action to render a template with the same name contained in a folder named after its controller. So if I went down to the views folder and created in yo-yos subfolder a new.html.erb, form work, something like that's going to happen later on. We'll talk about forms tomorrow. For now, like, I think the cool thing is that in config routes, we can define any sort of RESTful resources that we want just by saying resources yo-yos, right? I could say resources tricks. Now, if I look at my routes, I'm going to have routes for all of my yo-yos and all of my tricks. Maybe I decide that I want tricks to be deleted, but not yo-yos, right? I can go to routes, I can add stuff to yo-yos. I can say accept, delete. Come back and check my routes out again, and we're not going to see yo-yo delete show up in this second list. Oh no, I missed it. Sorry, not delete. It's destroy. I always get delete and destroy confused. This should do it. And let me make a slightly more marked change. Let's say that we can't like edit a yo-yo either, so I don't want any edit or any update action to be able to happen for these. Oh, and by the way, like the opposite of accept is only, so I should be able to say resources tricks, but only give me the ability to like index and show a trick, right? I can't like new or create the tricks yet. So we can use these kind of keywords. Accept is exclusive and only is inclusive. And now we only have those two trick paths for index and show. And then for the prefix yo-yos, we have like get, post, get, and get just for index, create, new, and show because we left all the updating and deleting out with the accept keyword. So when we draw these resources out, it's very important for us to regularly run Rails routes because that tells me, like, number one, what's the URL that I'll travel to as a user, right? Number two, like, what is the pattern that a form needs to know about to point in the right direction? If I'm trying to create a yo-yo, I need to make sure that my form is going to post yo-yos according to how these routes are configured. What controller and action are going to handle a given route that I'm defining. That's a really key thing. If I'm printing out from the wrong controller method for an hour, that's a super frustrating hour. And then finally, like these prefixes here. I want to talk about these prefixes super duper quick because we can use them in the browser. So when I have this new, right, let's say that I just wanted to go back to index. I have link helpers in Rails. So I could make an anchor tag with an href equaling /yo-yos. This is how I might have used to do it, right? And then we close the tag, and I say back to index, right? So when I go to the page for new, I just see a link to go back to the index. Back to index, I click, It's there. And then maybe from the index, I want to make a slightly more modern link to go to new. So I go to the index HTML, and then right here, I go to like make a create new link. But now I'm going to use Rails a little bit. I'm going to say a method that Rails gives us, which is a helper for building links. I say link to, and the Rails link to method takes two arguments. The first argument is what the user sees, and the second argument is the href attribute. So we're going to say link to create new, comma, and then we're going to pass in the actual URL. Now the URL here is going to be /yoyos/new, right? So let's try that. /yoyos/new. And of course we want to render our link. So we'll go here and refresh. Now we have a create new link. It's purple. That feels like a good sign. We've created these two links, right? On the index, we've used the link to, which I think is an advancement beyond what new knew about, right? This is just a bland link tag. Now we've used the link to, right? So maybe over here, new gets jealous and says like, you know what? I can do better than this. I can improve myself. And then they say, I'm gonna one up you, index. I'm gonna make a link to, but I'm gonna make it even more Railsy. Link to. And we'll say here back to index. And then I'm going to say yo-yo's path. How do I know that yo-yo's path is going to work? Because the prefix for the index route that goes to get yo-yo's is yo-yo's, right? So if I say yo-yo's path, that's going to take me to the matching URI, which is /yoyos. Let's see what it does. If I go back to create new, now I have two links. If I click on the second link, it works just as well as the first, right? Both of these links work exactly the same way. The second one, Rails has just kind of generated up for us. So we've generated a model, we've created some routes, we've created some views, and started to dip into how these views might connect with one another using some of the Rails route stuff in the terminal. I think that it's really important to see how key this is to understanding everything today, that this will tell you what controller actions you can do. It's going to tell you what kind of underscore path methods you get to call in the controller. Oh, and by the way, you're going to run into this mistake too. This happens all the time, so I should mention this. Instead of saying yo-yo's path, you're going to do something like this, where you say yo-yo path, because you forget about singular versus plural. And then you're going to run into this. URL generation error in yo-yo's new. And then it says no route matches action show controller yo-yos. Action show should be the tell here. I wasn't trying to link back to the index action. Or sorry, I was trying to do that. I wasn't trying to link back to a show action. I'm trying to go back to the index. So it's saying it wants to do a show route instead, and it's missing a required key ID. That's because yo-yo path gives me this prefix, right? And yo-yo path prefix returns this URI pattern. And this URI pattern is incomplete without a value for ID. So if I really did want to go to the show path for yo-yo number one, I might make a change here where like this is still my back to index. I could say here view yo-yo one. And this could be yo-yo path, and I could pass in 1, right? Because now that's going to fill in the ID of 1 where it matches up in the URL. Let's check it out. We refresh. Now I go mouse over view yo-yo 1, and as I mouse over, I can see in the bottom corner of my browser that it does say yo-yo's 1 down in localhost down there. I don't know if everybody can make that out, but it was down there for a split second. If I click on this, now we have a problem. There's no action show for the controller. And if I'm really trying to whip through this real quick, I could build one. Def show. We make a show.erb. But first, we're going to need to put a yo-yo there at yo-yo equals yo-yo dot find params. How do I know it's params ID? Because Rails routes told me, right? This is the name of the param according to the URI pattern. So yo-yo.find params ID, and then I don't need to actually say what to render because I have a views yo-yo subfolder. Make a new file, call it show.html.erb, and then we'll just embed maybe like the yo-yo's name to prove our point. Yo-yo.name. Cool, let's try that out. We refresh. Butterfly Uno, there's our yo-yo name, undecorated, because I didn't put it inside of any HTML. But kind of in a whirlwind nutshell, this is like some boom Rails stuff, right? Like we didn't really do a whole lot here in writing, like we wrote a couple of things in a couple of view files. We wrote very small methods and controllers and very minimal code in here. And what put the rest of it together was the assumptions that Rails made about where things are going to live based on their name and how things are going to hook up. I think the biggest leap between Sinatra and Rails, it's what's going on in this config file in this routes.rb config folder routes.rb file, because this gives us the ability to manually create routes as we wish. But as we saw, manually creating a route, right? Sometimes you make a little mistake. If you want to have Rails make sure that it can standardize stuff for you, you can do resources like this, yo-yos and tricks. Later on, we'll even talk about like how you might nest resources so the namespaces nest within each other. The main key, though, is to know that nothing is going to work in your app if you don't have some sort of route definition in this file, and you're not going to understand how anything works in the app until you get into the habit of calling Rails routes regularly to see everything your app is going to be able to do and how that controller is going to expect to connect to the URI and the HTTP method. I think one last thing that I'd like to show is a very powerful generator that I don't think anybody should actually try to use. But what if I tried, instead of like a model generator, what if I tried something like this? Rails G scaffold clown, and a clown will have a name and an age that's an integer, and we'll have a phrase, and we'll have I don't know, like is cool, which will be a Boolean. Sure, let's see what happens. So that's a Rails G scaffold. Notice what it's created. It created a migration. It created a model. It created a controller. It created several views and all the test stuff that we saw before. If I say Rails DB migrate, we will make this clown real. The power of Rails conventions is that most of the decisions of making a basic app aren't actually decisions, right? They're patterns. They're things that you could teach anybody how to do, which means you could teach nobody how to do it. You could teach a machine how to do it, right? A machine could build the basics of what it means to be a clown, just based on getting some like early stuff. I'm going to make a 113-year-old clown that is cool. And we'll create the clown. Cool. And then we've got Bozo, right? I don't know. Maybe not that cool. Maybe a little older. Sure. Let's update the clown. Sure, that works. Let's go back. I don't know. That's too old for a clown. And then that makes him cool again. Cool. So, and then we'll also say like Bozo Jr. Because this is the child of Bozo now. Great. So that clown is updated. Let's go back. We can see it in the list. We can destroy the clown. Ooh, no, let's not destroy the clown. Let's make a new clown that we want to. We're going to call this Bye-Bye the Clown. And then that clown is going to be 1,000,000 years old. And then the phrase is going to be farewell. And it's not cool because it's got to say bye-bye, and it can't be cool in those kind of circumstances. So then say goodbye. Okay. So that's Scaffold. Scaffold basically builds a bunch of boilerplate for you. Oh, by the way, Scaffold, it also handles validations and error handling. So we talked a little bit about that last week with Sinatra. And if you're ever curious about, like, does Rails do error handling like that? We could use this clown model just as, like, a test case. We could say, like, validates presence of name and phrase, right? And then we go back to our browser and we go to create a new clown and we leave name and phrase blank and we create clown and boom, 2 errors prohibited this clown from being saved. Name can't be blank, phrase can't be blank. Cool, so I'll leave the name and I'll put in like an age in here, but we'll leave the phrase blank and then we go to create clown. And hey, look at that, it's managing to hang on to our actual clown information right in the form. So by default, Scaffold will build a lot of nice Rails stuff for you. I'm going to leave the Scaffold code in here, like for the sake of posterity with this code, just so that you can kind of see how Rails hooks an app up if you're the, if you're the type to kind of learn from reverse engineering some stuff that's already there. But I will stress that you should never use the Scaffold command to generate code that you're going to turn into like a potential employer or something, because they're going to be able to tell from all the extra files that you generated that you didn't write the code yourself, and you're invariably going to leave some like CSS in that's also a tell, and they're looking for people that can like write code, not just people that can like use copy paste terminal commands and stuff. But Scaffold is very useful for somebody who needs to test how something might work in a Rails application environment and is not really concerned about the app that they're building right now as much as they're concerned with like how that gem would fit into things or how this other library is going to be able to talk to an app, right? Rails makes it very easy to fast forward the no-brainer development steps of a project. But yeah, the general generators that I would want you to use are probably gmigrate, maybe gmodel, perhaps. But I think that generating migrations and models is probably where I'd keep it. It's not too hard to write a controller by hand. In fact, it's not too hard to write a model file by hand. If you were going to be really gung ho about it, just generate migrations and nothing else. Only the generated timestamp is the time that you're really going to save more time in terms of not just losing understanding opportunity. We covered a lot. We covered like how to create a new Rails app, how to generate models and migrations and controllers. We talked about some similarities and differences between how routing happens. We built some basic views, and we just started to dip our toes into some of the potential of like the link builder and path helper syntax that Rails provides us to navigate between our app. I'm wondering if anybody has any questions at this time. Cool, cool. Well, if that'll do it for now, please just throw like a quick exclamation point up into the chat in lieu of applause, because I don't want anything to get like mass unmuted and break eardrums or headphones and stuff like that. But I will say goodbye to y'all. Thanks so much for hanging through. I'm very, very excited to hear feedback about this. Like I said before, we are all very much in a beginner mindset right now. I think that like if this is your first time having to learn something remotely on a pivot, it's definitely my first time like teaching remotely on a pivot. And so I'm very curious and grateful in advance for any feedback that you have, even if you are very frustrated or feeling lost on stuff and don't necessarily know how to give me the feedback in the kindest terms. Please trust that I am experienced in hearing feedback that's on the brutal side of brutal kindness and still trying to find the useful stuff out of it. So if anything is going completely awry for you and you're feeling at a loss or really upset, please just try to get me the feedback in whatever format you can, and I will find the useful tissue to pull out of a Kleenex box flying at my head if necessary, and we'll figure out how to have a better time with it. Yeah, cheers, y'all. Dig into labs today. I think that the focus is going to be working through some of the Rails labs at your own pace. If you are still working through some of the things in Sinatra, now is a good time to consider actually hitting pause on that, because the whole point of learning some of the Sinatra stuff was to prepare you for some of the Rails stuff, but you might be at a point that you're ready to actually have some of those clicking light bulb aha moments. I think it's better to have those moments in Rails than to try to like have them the first time in Sinatra and then maybe it's halfway done in the weekend before you start on any Rails stuff. I think that everybody should be started on Rails stuff today so that they can know how their system is working with Rails and handle any sort of setup issues before the weekend kicks in. So please be aggressive about focusing on today's labs, about Rails setup, and starting to move toward like some of the Rails association stuff that will be out later on. That's all. Thanks, y'all.